Hi guys! So, problem 10 from the Pre-Calc Knowledge Pretest asks us to find the zeros of this function. So, just to remind ourselves what the zeros are, let's say we're looking at a quadratic function. In graph form, it looks something like this. Just any old quadratic formula. And any old quadratic function, rather. And wherever we hit the x-axis, we cross the x-axis with our graph, those are zeros, because it's where y equals 0. So if we want to figure out where y equals 0, we should probably set y equal to 0, shouldn't we? So if we do that, we're well on our way to looking for zeros in this quadratic function. So what happens next? Well, we're trying to isolate x, because a 0 is the x value at which our quadratic function crosses the x-axis, or makes y equals 0. So how can we isolate x? Well, for one thing, I see that there's a factor of 3 between all of these, so I'm going to factor a 3 out. 3 times x squared minus 2x minus 2. Now, if you'd like to redistribute the 3 just to convince yourself that this is equal, feel free to do that now. Otherwise, I'm moving on. So, now that we have this, we can continue figuring out if this is equal to 0, then this 3 doesn't really count for much, because we're trying to get this whole expression equal to 0. And since 3 is not equal to 0, it means that this whole expression has to equal 0. So 0 equals x squared minus 2x minus 2. Then, how are we going to figure out which x values will get us 0? Well, we could try factoring out this expression. Is this expression factorable? That is to say, is there some value some two values perhaps, that if we did x plus the two of these values, x plus question mark, x plus question mark, if we factored this together, could we get this expression? Well, let's think about it. First of all, why is that valuable? And how do we know there's only two of these factors that we're looking for? Well, we know there's only two because when you multiply these two factors together, you end up with an highest order. That means the biggest exponent for x that you get is a 2. And that's the biggest that we have here. So suppose we did actually have a third factor of x plus some question mark. Well, then our highest order would be 3. So that wouldn't work. That wouldn't match up. So that's why we're not looking for anything bigger than 2 factors of different possible values. Or the same. These two question marks could be the same. But let's see. Can we actually find 2 question marks that will give us this equation? Well, that would mean that these 2 question marks multiplied together would have to equal -2. So our options for question marks are -1 and 2, -2 and 1, and then some funky looking things like -0.5 and 4, and the list goes on. But let's just think about these two here for now. And in this middle section, you have question mark times x plus question mark times x equals -2x. So that means that question mark plus question mark has to equal -2 as well. And in that case, we have lots of possibilities. But if we just look at our options here, let's say the first question mark is -1. Then the second question mark has to be -1 as well. And that doesn't match up with what this is telling us here for this multiplicative version of the question marks. Otherwise, if we had first question mark equal to -2, this one would have to be 0. And that doesn't work either. You could keep going through these examples to convince yourself that this expression is actually not factorable. Now, as we're going through trying to find the zeros, since we can't factor this thing, let's instead use the quadratic formula. Now, I always like to remember it by singing a little song. X is equal to negative b. X is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So that's my way of remembering the quadratic formula. Now, this way it's very easy to just plug in some x values. You make sure that you have this form of the function where it's a quadratic function set equal to 0, and that'll tell you that this is your a is whatever constant is out in front of x. Your b is whatever constant's out in front of x. Sorry, this is x squared, this is x. And your c is whatever constant is all by itself, not touching a variable. So if we plug those variables in, that a, b, and c, we'll find that x is equal to negative a negative 2 plus or minus, that means you could end up with two values, the square root of negative 2 squared minus 4 times 1, because that's a 1 there, if there's no coefficient, times negative 2 all over 2 times 1. So let's solve that through. 2 plus or minus the square root of 4 minus, what is that, 8? It's actually plus 8. All over 2. So that's all times 1/2. Then that implies x is equal to, well, let's say 1/2 times 2 plus or minus the square root of 12. That is not a perfect square, so I'm not going to solve it through. So this is the answer. This is the value of our two zeros. We have two zeros. X is equal to either 2 plus the square root of 12 all over 2, or 2 minus the square root of 12 all over 2.